Thank you everyone for being here today. Just formatting wise, I'll ask him several questions, and then after about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, we'll open it up to audience question and answer. So you'll get a chance to ask your own questions during that time. But we're lucky here to have Dr. Clark Alexander. He's the director of the UGA Skidaway Institute of Oceanography and a professor in the Department of Marine Sciences. He earned his BS in oceanography and BA in geology, in both a master's and a PhD in marine geology from North Carolina State University. He joined the Skidaway Institute of Oceanography in 1989 and was appointed director in 2017. He is a coastal and marine geologist who currently focuses on coastal resilience, sedimentary processes, and marine resource mapping. Alexander works closely with local and state governments to address pressing coastal management needs. Thank you for being here. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the barrier island that most of us are the most familiar with, and that's Tybee Island. So what changes are we seeing to Tybee's beaches?
Well, as anyone that goes to the beach on Tybee can see, in general, what we're seeing are large-scale erosional patterns on the beach. Oh, I've got a picture. So behind me on the screen, you can see a image of Tybee Island. That image shows the work that we've been doing on Tybee Island to sort of follow the patterns of erosion and deposition that we have on the island since they built their new beach back in January, February of 2020. At that same time, they built a new set of dunes on the island to protect the island from overwash, which was one of the major issues and that caused a lot of damage during both Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Hurricane Irma in 2017. So since that beach was built, well, actually I should explain what you're looking at. What you're looking at back here is a image that shows you elevation of the beach and dune system on the island. So cool colors like the blue, those are low elevations, and hot colors like the yellow, sort of stringy colors you can see on the map, those are high elevations. And as you might imagine, the long linear yellow lines that you're seeing there are dunes that exist on the island in Tybee. So if we look at the middle of the image where we see that arrow pointing, that's where Highway 80 comes out onto the island, the big curve to the south on the island, and that is one of the areas that is most affected by erosion on the island today and historically. The other area down to the little further south, you can see there's multiple lines, multiple beach ridges, dunes there, and those ridges have actually been forming over the last 30 or 40 years in response to renourishing of the beach on Tybee. Tybee had their first beach renourishment in mid-1970s, and since that time they have had renourishments about every decade. Some of that sand from every renourishment stays in the center of the island, as you can see there with those dunes that have built seaward over time, whereas other parts of the island, like where Highway 80 comes to the ocean, those areas have been retreating most rapidly over time. The very north end of the island that you can see at the very top of that image, you can see that it looks like it's very changeable. You know, we've got a lot of sand up there at sometimes. We have less sand at other times. So that's a very dynamic region, and we've just started examining the beach on the northwest side of the island there. Although the data that we have, only a year's worth of data right now, shows significant erosion in that part of the island. The very south end of the island, as many of you who have been to the beach at low tide can verify, there are vast quantities of sand that are constantly shifting around in what's called an ebb tidal delta, That's because these big sandy deposits, which are so prominent at low tide, are formed from sand that's moving down the island and then into the inlet there at Back River. And then that sand is being deposited into a big sandy delta, and it's called a ebb tidal delta because it is seaward and driven by the ebb tides. It's seaward of the inlet. Those are very common and are very characteristic of the southern South Carolina coast and the Georgia coast. We see the opposite with the deltas actually inside the inlets in areas where wave energy is more important. So like up in North Carolina, Cape Hatteras, as you get further down into Florida. So these ebb tidal deltas are important repositories of sand here in coastal Georgia. And then of course that sand that's coming from Tybee into that ebb tidal delta is then going down to Little Tybee over time. Then it's going down and crossing through the ebb tidal delta at Wausau Sound, and so on and so on. The image on the left that you can see here, sort of illustrates the layout, if you will, of the coast of Georgia, with Barrier Island stretching from Tybee Island all the way down to Cumberland Island on the Florida border. In each of these, the major features that you can see on those islands, you can see Tybee, Wausau, Ossabaw Island as these linear strips of greener, higher elevations. And then behind that, you see the darker areas. That's all salt marsh, which fills in really our intertidal areas between the mainland or older barrier islands like Skidaway, like Wilmington. But we have marsh in those areas, and then we have our extensive tidal creeks. The ebb tidal deltas aren't visible on here because this is not a very low tide image.
So a lot of people around here, mainly landowners on Tybee Island, would be interested to know about the potential economic impacts of the changing shorelines of Tybee. Can you speak a little bit about that and what we can expect?
Sure. As we all know, the reason we rebuild the beach on Tybee and the reason we build the dunes on Tybee is because having a beach there as an attraction for tourists to come visit, for people that want to live on Tybee, is an economic engine for the city, for the state, for the region. And so there are of course, significant ramifications to not having a beach present. So it's really an economic decision. Does the cost to build back that beach every 10 years, which is most recently has been about $10 million, will you get more benefit from tax revenue and visitorship and tourism than the cost of the renourishment? Now, thankfully for Tybee, because the federal shipping channel of the Savannah River is responsible for a lot of the erosion on Tybee, because it intercepts the sand that should be coming in what we call the longshore transport system through the big ebb tidal delta off the mouth of the Savannah River. Because that sand is not able to reach Tybee because it gets stuck in the channel, dredged up, and then either disposed of offshore or in the upland disposal areas that you're probably familiar with that line the north side of the Savannah River. That sediment is lost from the system, and so the federal government, they go through a calculation to see how much of the erosion they're responsible for, and so they pay about $8 of the $10 million for the renourishment every year, or every decade, excuse me.
And when they renourish the beach, are they doing this to all the necessary areas of Tybee, or are they kind of focusing on the tourist central areas?
They do only focus on the areas that serve the public, because the Army Corps of Engineers is using federal money to put that sand back up on the beach. So if you have a section of beach that has no public access, that's not going to be part of the federal project. And so right now the federal project goes from, I believe, the north end groin all the way down to the south end. And so that is where the Corps of Engineers is authorized to place sand.
So we had a couple big storms this past hurricane season. So I know you've been tracking some of that and the changes through aerial footage. Have you noticed any changes since Helene in particular, or any of those storms that we've had this past hurricane season?
Yeah, let me just briefly address the sort of average everyday erosion rates that we're seeing annually on Tybee. And we see something on the order of, maybe 10 to 15 meters of erosion of the shoreline every year. So, 45, 50 feet, something like that. And so that is recession, and so narrowing of that beach platform where everybody can sit when the tide is high. A single storm can do almost that much damage, and that's something we documented with Helene and I believe with Nicole. But there were two storms that so we go out and fly the beach with a drone that allows us to calculate volumes of sediment in the dunes and on the beach. And then from one year to the next, we subtract those volumes from each other to find out how much sand we're losing. Now, we did go out after doing our quarterly survey, and then did one right after a storm when they were those two time periods were relatively close together. So that's how we're able to document the amount of erosion of the shoreline and loss of sand volume. So we've lost about 200,000 cubic yards of sand from Tybee since they renourished the beach in 2020. That is about a fifth of what they placed on the beach. So there's a lot of sand still remaining. A lot of it is moved to other parts of the beach. And I think that because we map the beach now, we know where the sand accumulates, we know where the sand leaves from quickly. And so we are working with the city of Tybee, to tell them where their new dunes are going to be starting to be eroded most at the earliest time, so they can plan to maybe do spot renourishments to just strengthen that part of the beach. But also we can tell them, where the highest erosion rates on the island are, what those rates are, and then you can use that for planning. Well, perhaps instead of just putting the beach as wide as it was every time in the areas that are most erosional, perhaps we need to go farther seaward and build that part of the beach further seaward. So after you factor in all the erosion, which is higher here than it is here, perhaps, that they all arrive at the same location when it's time for the next renourishment.
I imagine we'll have some follow-up questions from the audience for Tybee, but I also wanted to move on to some of our other barrier islands and talk about the changes that we're seeing on the shorelines of our other barrier islands. One that sticks out to me going there often is Wausau, but all of the islands off of all of the barrier islands off of our coast. What kind of changes are we seeing on those islands compared to Tybee, maybe? And can you speak a little bit about the natural processes that are going on there?
Sure. I mentioned the longshore transport system, and that is this process that moves sand generally from the north to the south along both the coasts of the U.S., both the west coast, I should say the west and the east coasts. It doesn't move north to south on the Gulf Coast. It moves from east to west. But basically, these are natural processes that drive sand transport for a variety of processes we can talk about later if you'd like. Mostly it has to do with where the wave energy comes from and the angle at which those waves attack the shore. So if they're coming in at an angle like this, you're going to have some component that's driving the sand in that direction. So that's the basic idea. So you have this, if you want to think about it as a conveyor belt, you can, although it's not that continuous. But this longshore transport system is eroding sand on the north ends of all the islands, transporting it down the fronts of those islands, and then depositing some of it at the south end of those islands. And then, but some of the sand is going out into that ebb tidal delta and then going down to the next island to replenish it. Now, so that's the natural process. These ebb tidal deltas, because they are such great holders of sand, you really build up those deltas for a decade, maybe two, and then during big storms, you'll tear a bunch of that ebb tidal delta off and bring it into an island on its north end. So the north ends of our islands actually, they erode back and then they get replenished very quickly. Then they erode back. Wausau Island, I first came here in 1985 as a graduate student on a Barrier Island comparative field trip. And the north end of Wausau at that time was nothing but old exposed marsh. You know, there was no sand there. It's the most bizarre thing I'd ever seen in my life at the time. But by the early 1990s, there had been a slug of that sand had come in. The whole north end of the island had moved northward and into Wausau Sound by 100 feet or so, and there was no exposed salt marsh mud at all. So, and the front side of the island, just to expound a little more, the front side of the island had large, big dune ridges, and the front side of the island had moved a quarter of a mile further seaward. There were big lagoons out there. There were all kinds of sand there. And then over the last couple of decades, all of that has been removed. And actually, right now, one of the ponds that has been on Wausau and was a brackish pond for many, many years is now being eroded into. So Wausau desperately needs more sand. And that's one good thing about renourishing Tybee Island, is that it keeps putting sand into that longshore transport system, so that sand can go down to replenish the other islands. In terms of islands that are significantly undergoing erosion, St. Catharines is probably the most erosive island on the Georgia coast. If you look at where it is, it's the fourth island down, pretty much, and it is as far away from the Savannah River, which is a source of sediment to the coast, and it's about as far away from a source of sediment as you can get. We'll talk about barrier islands and sediment supply if someone brings that up. It's a whole nother topic, whole nother night maybe. Who knows?
So speaking a little bit more about Wausau, maybe that's just because the one I'm the most familiar with here, but I grew up going to the north end of Wausau, and obviously that has shrank a lot. And so is the only way that we can expect that beach to become larger, for that shoreline to be replenished, is through the mitigation efforts on Tybee? And do we know when we might be able to see that beach become larger again? Can we expect that?
Well, we can expect it
Yeah.
because of this sort of long scale recycling of sand that moves down the coast.
Sure.
When we can expect it, I mean, it should be fairly soon because it's been several decades now. Other than that, no, there's not much in the way that's going to renourish that island. One of the issues, we know where sand is located in terms of wanting to renourish Tybee Beach. There's been a lot of money put into exploring nearshore waters, finding out where beach quality sand exists. The same thing is true for Sea Island, St. Simon's Island, and Jekyll Island. There's been work done there in state waters looking for where beach quality sand exists. And that's because there is a lot of upland infrastructure that you might want to replenish a beach if it gets destroyed in a storm. So you want to know where your sand resources might be. We have a number of islands in Georgia that are owned by the state. That's a state heritage preserve. It's 2 federal wildlife refuges. There's a national seashore. So there's a lot of islands that are actually well protected here along the Georgia coast, and there is not that financial incentive to find where are the sand resources. But we're actually in the middle of a project right now that is going out sampling sands offshore of the undeveloped barrier islands, because we want to be able to say we know where beach quality sand probably is if, say, the nice sandy intertidal habitat for shorebirds and for turtles and things like that get destroyed in a hurricane. There might end up being resources, financial resources made available to rebuild critical habitat for threatened and endangered species, perhaps.
So before I turn it over to the audience for question and answer, I wanted to ask a little bit more about our salt marshes, because I know you do a lot of work in that as well. So, there's rumors, that sort of thing, about our salt marshes potentially disappearing due to things like sea level rise. So what can we expect our salt marshes to look like in, say, 50 years? Are we still going to see lots of Spartina, or will they turn into mud flats around here? Or can you speak to that a little bit?
The answer is it depends. You're welcome. A lot of it will have to do with what the rate of sea level rise ends up being and how much sea level rise we see by the end of the century. Right now we have historic records. At Fort Pulaski, we have almost 90 years of record of monitoring where sea level stands. That data is actually available on the NOAA Tides and Currents website for those of you who are interested in going to see that for yourself. It shows that the rate of sea level rise has been about 3 millimeters per year, so a foot per century over that last 90 years. But the last 20 years of record seems to suggest that we're seeing a doubling, perhaps, in the rate of sea level rise. So that might mean 2 feet per century. So that would mean maybe 2 feet rise by the end of this century. With a 2-foot rise, the marshes should not have trouble keeping up because of the amount of sediment we have. And also, there's been some recent research that shows that our marsh sits very high in the tidal frame, so it's not underwater more than half a tidal cycle. And so Spartina likes to be in the upper half of the tidal range. So it's happy where it is. It can build up some. It can move on to the upland some. In areas that haven't been armored, where we don't have seawalls or things like that, or revetments. But if we have, and these are, very high projections for sea level rise, if we have something like 6 feet of sea level rise, which is not impossible if all things go bad, a lot of Antarctic and Greenland ice sheet melts. There's something like, I think, 50 feet of sea level rise in Greenland and ice and Antarctica together. So it's possible, probably not likely. But if we have 6 feet of sea level rise, the marsh is pretty much toast. That's where all the modeling that I'm familiar with suggests that we start to lose the marsh. Up to about 1.5 meters, so 5 feet of sea level rise, we should be fairly good, at least through the end of the century. And as I mentioned, I didn't say it out loud, because our marshes sit relatively high in the tidal frame, we have what's called elevation capital. There's a lot of room to go before our marshes start getting inundated too frequently. So that's going to buy us some time.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to audience question and answer. I will pass around this microphone. So does anyone have a question? All right, coming over.
I do want, while he's going over there, I just want to say thank you all for coming to this experiment. This is a totally new format for evening at Skidaway. It's always been kind of the sage on the stage. And there is a place for that, with slides and data and all that kind of stuff. But we're really excited having Jackson Schroeder, our new communications person, bring this new kind of format for us to try. And so we'll be very interested in hearing what your thoughts are on it.
The question is, you said that the natural flow of sand goes generally from north to south. When does Newfoundland and Maine run out of sand? Wherever it's coming from, does it get replenished, or does it just run out?
Well, actually, a lot of, if you know the Maine coast and Newfoundland and those areas, they're actually quite rocky coasts. A lot of the sediment that is the start of the longshore transport system here in the U.S. is Long Island. And because that is the terminal moraine, that was all this loose sediment left behind when the continental glaciers, the ice sheet that was here during the last ice age, piled up a big deposit, and that has been eroding, and that is kind of what starts our longshore transport system here on the East Coast.
When do they run out?
That has not been something I've looked into. I'll get back to you. Someone else.
I think he will come right back to you.
So, Clark, I wanted to ask you about Little Tybee, which is a critical stopover for migratory birds, and it seems to be eroding rapidly. Even the uplands are eroding rapidly. Is that likely to continue? Is there anything that can be done if it does?
Well, I would have to lean back on the natural processes. You know, it sort of is the recipient of the sand from the ebb tidal delta at the end of Tybee. But what we've seen in that ebb tidal delta lately, you know, typically ebb tidal deltas will have several channels making their way through there, letting the water flow out. Right now, there's one major channel right up against the upland of Little Tybee. I mean, I would imagine, and that's what's causing a lot of that erosion, but I would imagine that over time, that's going to shift somewhere else. It's just the nature of how those channel systems function. But for right now, yeah, erosion is going on very quickly there.
Right back here, nothing bouncing around.
Okay, so my question is, when you talk about sand being, replenished, I guess my question is sand, like, is sand the same, period? Or, you know, if we replenish sand in a certain place with sand from somewhere else, does it then not flow correctly and replenish, you know, that?
No, I get where you're coming from. You know, so sand, it's really only a designation of a size of a particle, the term sand, right? So you can have sand that's made out of coral, made out of volcanic rock in Hawaii, black sand beaches. You know, here, you know, we always think about quartz particles, you know, and these are all just rocks that have been broken down over time and been transported to the sea. So really there are all different varieties of sand. Every state has regulations about how different sand can be if you're going to put it on a beach. You know, it can't be too coarse. It can't have too much shell. It can't be too much darker, because things like absorbing heat can change the sex of sea turtle eggs. You know, more the heat in the sand. The ranges that are acceptable, and that's why you go out and look for sand resources that are what I was calling beach compatible. You know, they can't be that different. The other thing is, if it's too coarse, you know, then the beach is not going to be very appealing to beachgoers, but also it can be off-putting to different sorts of animals like sea turtles. If it's the size of the sediment on a beach is in equilibrium with the energy that's coming into that beach. So, you know, and that's what's causing the erosion. If you put stuff on there that's much finer than what's on there, it's going to be gone in a heartbeat after your first winter storm. And so you have to bracket what kind of sand you collect, and you do want to match.
You mentioned that the replenishment on Tybee is helping Warsaw Island, but Tybee has an issue with respect to the Savannah River channel and the dredging. If we stay in the neighborhood but look a little further north of the Savannah River channel, are there human activities or other activities that are potentially affecting what will happen on Tybee that can manage to either cross the Savannah River channel or be so overwhelming that it would that they be important? What's going on off the coast of South Carolina and maybe even North Carolina?
Well, I think that the very pertinent thing here is what's going on at Hilton Head, right? You know, Hilton Head's another resort island. They renourish their beach repeatedly. They actually fund it through a use tax. So everyone that comes to use the beaches there, they help pay for the renourishments. They replenish their beach. That sand comes down in front of Defusky, actually not right in front of Defusky, but in the very, very large ebb tidal delta, and it actually intercepts the shipping channel probably about 5 miles offshore. So you can actually follow the contours in the bathymetric or the ocean bottom charts, and you can see where that shallow waters all of a sudden go down into the channel. And you know that's where the sand is being transported and falling in the channel. So the one well, thank goodness that Hilton Head is still renourishing their beach, so they're putting sediment into the longshore transport system. But the thing that would be really beneficial to Tybee is if they were, instead of taking these beach quality sands that are being sequestered by the channel, and then typically they'll dredge them up and they'll take them offshore to a disposal site, which is in about 40 feet of water. And that's much too deep for waves and currents to pick that sand up and bring it back to the beach. So it's just lost to the system. You know, so if in California, and actually, I just heard someplace they do these continual bypassing operations where they put a dredge on one side of the channel, have pipe going to the other side, and it's continuously bypassing the sediment, basically doing what nature wants to do, but doing it as a engineering activity to keep the system in equilibrium. Those are the kinds of things that I think would be very beneficial that we could do to help with the erosion on Tybee.
Thank you for doing this. This is a great opportunity to absorb your knowledge. Whenever you're on the beach and you see somebody walking on the dunes or lounging on the dunes, you want to tell them somehow politely that's not a great idea, but you're always afraid that you're going to sound patronizing or condescending or not sure what to tell them. What would be your advice in that situation?
My advice is to tell them that those dunes, you know, have been laboriously built by wind moving sand up into those dunes, naturally building a defense system to protect the uplands on that island, and any vegetation that is establishing itself, whether they can see it or not. All those kinds of things are leading to better protecting the island, and anytime you intrude into that, you are damaging that system. You know, the thing that I think is important for people to realize, one of the reasons why they built a continuous line of dunes on Tybee is that they found that when, you know, the storm surge came up, wherever there were lows in the dunes or areas where the beach was just flat with no dunes, you know, that's where you got water intrusion. That's where you got sand pushed to the backside of the island. That's where you got water and flooding damage. So, you know, those dunes are really a sacrificial first line of defense. And so you want to do everything you can to preserve them and keep them as the sacrifice if erosion is going to occur during a storm. You want those dunes to be there to take the brunt of it.
Yes, I love the beach at Tybee, but I live on Skidaway. I'm curious about what you think about the coastline of Skidaway over the next 10 to 20 or 50 years. What are we looking forward to or not forward to?
Well, if you've lived on Skidaway any length of time, you've probably are very familiar with how we're having shallow saltwater intrusion into the surficial aquifer. So all those wells, the shallow wells people have drilled, to water their plants or whatever, have had to be abandoned. So those sorts of things are only going to continue. The sea level rise is only going to continue. I mean, there's no scenario where sea level rise reverses itself because the sea levels are rising from two main factors. One is the addition of new water into the ocean. That's from melting ice caps, melting glaciers, and that's about a third of the signal. The other signal is just basic expansion of the water that's already in the ocean basins. And that's just a natural process as well. Water warms up, it expands, and so we have both of those processes acting. We know global temperatures are warming. I mean, I think we all have seen the news about, this was the hottest January on record, and we keep hearing these kinds of things. So we know temperatures are rising. We also know that there is melting going on. And so both of those factors are going to continue to cause sea level rise. At what rates we can argue about. We can argue about which model best represents the rate of rise that we're going to see. Most models, and I'll just throw this out here, suggest something like 3 feet by the end of the century, by 2100, which we can envision. The other thing but I just want to say that's kind of where the science ends up. When you want to look at the outliers, how bad could it get? Then we're talking 6 or 7 feet. If you were to extrapolate the data we've had from the last 90 years, it would say we're going to go up another foot, but that is not what the recorded data at Fort Pulaski are telling us. And then I think I lost the track of that question. What was the other?
I want to know when I have to sell.
Oh, yes. So,
Before my feet get wet.
so NOAA is starting to put out their projections for 2050, because that's a time period that we can all relate to. I mean, please Lord, we're all going to be here to see 2050. And those sorts of amounts of rise, are a foot or so, and those are things that we're starting to anticipate, as opposed to just argue about is it the best model or not. Those, it doesn't matter which model you use, they all start to diverge as you get out into the next 50 years. And so I would say you should be thinking about a foot of sea level rise in the next 20 years.
Sir, thank you. It's very informative. You've been talking all about the ocean side, but on the back river and the area, we've seen a lot more sediment just recently. I say recently over the last year than we have in the past. There's places like Chimney Creek where the crab shack is. There's times you can't get a boat to it anymore, which is very unusual. Is that just the normal change, or is there something about more sediment coming into the back river area?
I'm not familiar with any large scale changes in sediment input. One thing that I would be interested in exploring, if it were me trying to figure this out, I would want to look at some aerial photographs to see whether maybe I've had a cutoff, where you have these migrating channels and at some point it cuts off, or it might merge with another system. Because whenever you change how the water is flowing through that tidal marsh system, you end up getting different areas of deposition, different areas of erosion. So that would be the first thing that I would do. But I'm not aware of any large scale change here along the coast.
Got time for about 2 more questions. Maybe 3.
Thank you. I have a question. I love the beach on Tybee, but when it was renourished the last time, the question that came up with us was, what is the ecological impact on the outer lying area where the sand is dredged up from? How is that affected by all that?
There's been a good bit of research on that area, and if you plan your they call it a borrow area, where they're dredging the sand from. If you plan it well, whole, where you do disturb, the benthic fauna for a little while you're dredging, but that hole over the next 5, 6, 7 years will trap more of that sand moving in the longshore transport system and fill itself back in. And so you're basically creating your own little conveyor belt. You know where the sand's going to be, and it's glorious. When you plan it poorly, as there have been some examples, particularly on the Gulf Coast that I'm familiar with, after you dredge up the sand, the hole fills up with mud, and so it's never the same kind of habitat that it was, and it's not as environmentally responsive to the needs of the biota. One thing I will mention is there's been a good bit of work also done on what's the impact of a renourishment on the organisms that live in the beach. Because I always wondered, you dump all this sand there, what about it? Now, of course, the stuff that's on the bottom, yes, it gets buried, it gets killed, but it only takes about a year or so for those communities to reestablish themselves just from other organisms, similar organisms that are in the surf zone and in other areas that are just transported by currents. So it's not a long-term impact on things that feed on the organisms that live in the beach and things like that. And then I think she had a question over there.
So is there erosion on the back side of the island? So we're talking about the front sides of the island, but on the back sides of the island, is related to sea level rise or any natural process?
Yes, that's a great question. We do have erosion on the backsides of the islands, but it is limited to areas where we have meandering tidal creeks that are, eating into the back as they migrate. So you're all familiar, I hope, with this process where, as tidal creeks meander, they erode on one side and they deposit sediment on the other side. So they're always moving back and forth. They can get overextended and they'll end up cutting off and leave an oxbow, which many of you may have seen. And so we do get these cutting into the backsides of the island. We've done some research in my lab looking at erosion rates on the front sides of islands where we have energetic ocean conditions, where you can get erosion rates and change rates of meters, 5 to 10 feet per year. Something like that is not atypical. But when you go into the back barrier environments, because it's much more associated with migrating tidal creeks, you get back to rates that are more like a foot per year. But you do see, over a long enough geologic time, I guess you could call that planing off the backsides of the islands. Yes, ma'am.
So you were talking about the 5 feet that Skidaway could handle, right? You said because of the grasslands.
Oh yeah, well the marshes in general here in Georgia. Mm-hmm.
Right. So when possibly we are at 5 feet and the grasslands are trying to protect the island, when you know how it rains now and you look at the gutters on the side of the road, they're already full.
Yes.
So what would that look like? What would storms look like at that 5 feet level, even though the marshes are keeping it at bay? And second part of that is, what place, maybe on the East Coast, is most set up to be able to take the highest amount of rise?
I'm not sure. I'll think about that second part of your question, but the first part of your question gets to something that Jackson didn't ask me, that that he was going to, that how with rising sea levels, how our municipalities and our people trying to incorporate this into their planning, into their long-term planning. I can say with a lot of satisfaction that within the last decade, Chatham County, City of Savannah, many of the municipalities, Glenn County, up and down the Georgia coast are starting to at least consider sea level rise as they're making zoning ideas and elevation offsets for flood zones and things like that. When I first, not even when I first came here, 20 years ago, there was no consideration of sea level rise. The water level was always going to be in the same place, and so we could just set our planning and zoning, assuming the water would always be where it is going to be. Now everyone understands that is not going to be the case, and so I'm happy to say that a number of both city, county, state governments are starting to plan for sea level rise. The best day of my career, I got in front of the Metropolitan Planning Commission here in Chatham County, and I was giving them a 10-minute brief on sea level rise just to introduce the topic because they'd never heard about it before. And a lot of the folks on the Metropolitan Planning Commission, they're developers or economic development folks. And one of the guys who was still is a big developer in town, stood up and said, "Now I know why all that marsh grass is growing in those lots I've been holding for investments. Because as sea level rises, that the salinity gets higher and higher, and so the marsh grass starts growing. And so everyone can see it once it's pointed out to them. There's lots of evidence for what's going on around us, and it's available to anybody who is informed about what they're seeing. So that's why I'm all glad that you're here tonight. And so I was able to talk with you and share some of the things that I know. Maybe you can tell them to other people, and other folks can be educated about these things as well.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.